I'm Cody Daigle-Oriens, and welcome to StoryFest 2020. Due to the ongoing impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, StoryFest 2020 is going virtual. From September 15th through September 29th, StoryFest will premiere 13 live and pre-recorded author events, featuring top authors and creators in genre fiction, comics, young adult fiction, and middle grade fiction. This year, we have over 50 authors joining us from all across the country, and in cross-genre panels, they will explore the big ideas at the heart of telling stories in today's world. Even though we can't welcome you to the library's forum in person, we're glad to have you with us virtually. Thanks for being here, and enjoy StoryFest 2020. Mintie Das was born in India, raised in Macomb, Illinois, and now lives in Finland. She's been traveling the globe since childhood and always finds inspiration in the discovery of the unknown. Mintie spent 12 years organizing international events for governments around the world and the UN. Mintie's Storm Sisters, The Sinking World was translated into 7 languages. Brown Girl Ghosted marks her U.S. debut. Natasha Diaz is a freelance writer and producer. As a screenwriter, Natasha has been a quarter-finalist in the Austin Film Festival and a finalist for both the NALIP Diverse Women in Media Fellowship and the Sundance Episodic Story Lab. Her personal essays have been published in The Establishment and The Huffington Post. Her current release is Color Me In. Coco Ma is a Canadian author and pianist. At the age of 15, she wrote the first book of the Shadow Frost trilogy and hasn't looked back since. After learning the piano during her childhood, she has performed on some of the world's greatest concert stages and graduated with a pre-college diploma in piano performance from the Juilliard School in New York City. Currently, she studies at Yale University. At this point, she wishes she could mention having a dog or a small dragon, except pets, and happiness apparently, are tragically prohibited at her dormitories. Tobly McSmith is the co-creator and writer of 7 somewhat successful musical parodies, including Friends, the musical parody. Tobly was born in Texas. He now lives in New York City with his 2 cats, Buster and Bananas McSmith. Tobly is proud to be transgender, and he is the author of Stay Gold. Jenny Lee is a television writer and producer who has worked on BET's Boomerang, IFC's Brockmire, Freeform's Young and Hungry, and the Disney Channel's #1 rated kids show, Shake It Up. Jenny is the author of 4 humor essay collections and 2 middle grade novels. Anna K., A Love Story, is her debut YA novel. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 135-pound Newfoundland Gemma. And yes, it's a toss-up on who's walking who every day.
Okay, welcome to Valuing the Spectrum of Identities in YA. I am Kim, and I'm here with my friend Rebecca, and we are very excited to have such an amazing panel of authors of YA. So we're going to jump right in and get started, and the first thing that we would love is if all of our panelists could give us a little sort of bumper sticker byline advertisement for your books. So if anyone has one super ready, let me know. If not, we can give you a quick minute to think about it. But if anyone has one ready, let me know.
I can go first.
Okay, awesome. Go for it.
Okay, so this is my debut novel, Shadow Frost, and it's about a princess who has a single task, and that is to kill a demon that cannot be killed. So yeah, and actually, I just today got in the mail the sequel, the hardcover of the sequel, and I'm like so in love with it. And yeah, it basically just continues on the adventures, higher stakes, more death threats, that kind of thing. So yeah, very exciting.
That's awesome. We got a sneak peek in the first 30 seconds. Fantastic. Jenny, I feel like you were ready.
Oh, sure. My name is Jenny Lee, and I'm the author of Anna K., A Love Story, which is a modern retelling of Anna Karenina set in New York City and Greenwich, Connecticut.
Awesome.
I'll jump in. Hey, I'm Tobly. I wrote Stay Gold. I don't have it with me. I'm not at my house right now. But it is a young adult story. It's set in Texas, where I grew up, and it's a love story between Pony, a transgender boy who's transferred to a new high school and decided to go stealth or hide his gender identity, and Georgia, a cheerleader at that school.
Awesome.
I'll jump in. Okay, my book is Brown Girl Ghosted, which is so organically posted behind me as well. But and it's about a 16-year-old Indian American girl who was forced to fulfill her destiny as an Indian warrior queen while trying to survive high school and live a normal teenage life in her small Midwestern town. And it's all true. Not really. I mean, the Indian warrior queen stuff is made. Kind of true. Kind of true.
Okay, I read it and I'm questioning some parts.
Natasha.
I completely forgot to have a copy with me, so we're just gonna pretend like I do. But my book is called Color Me In, and it is a contemporary coming-of-age novel about a biracial Jewish white-presenting girl named Nevaeh Levitz, who is trying to figure out where she fits between her two worlds as she prepares for a belated bat mitzvah.
I was looking around because I know I have a copy of it somewhere on my bookshelves, but I'm not.
I think I have it somewhere now that I'm thinking about it. Because as soon as you finished it, I was like, I want it next. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Let's get started.
Okay. So here's our first question for you. We're thinking about identity, and how do you choose what aspects of identity to really focus on considering your audience? And then like what role does intersectionalism play in the choice of identity? And let's start with, we ended with Natasha. Let's start with Natasha.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, my book is literally all about intersections and identity. It's loosely based off my own life. I am multiracial, Jewish, and white presenting, and I wanted to really put my experience on the page in a fictionalized manner, but it was really the book I never had growing up. Even in biracial stories or Jewish stories, I rarely found that I found them all together intersecting, and especially even if I did find a biracial or multiracial narrative with a character who looked similar to me, I rarely found that the story touched on the privileges that we have, rather than just focusing on maybe like the internal struggle that is also very valid, but to me they go very hand in hand. And so it didn't feel like I could tell the story authentically without talking about that intersection, about the way that, yes, I am Black, but I cannot talk about my Blackness without talking about my whiteness, because they don't exist without one another. And that really colors my experience. And so I wanted to try to give truth to how complicated it is when you are in a multi-racial and interfaith family and person, but without shying away from really talking about privilege and white presenting privilege and how that affects my experience versus my family members.
Thank you. Tobly.
Yeah, so, when I sat down to write this book 2 years ago, it was because there weren't enough books out there with my story in it. There weren't trans narratives with a kid getting dead named and bullied and having to deal with saving up for his gender affirming healthcare and going stealth or not. And I really wanted to put all of that into a book. It was important for me. So I wanted to go back to my roots of where I grew up in Texas and write this story of this boy going through things that I've been through in that setting, kind of placing myself there and going back in time and putting myself into the story, which was really interesting and hard and really beautiful and therapeutic in ways too, to work through that. So that's that.
So it sounds like place was a really important part of your identity too.
100%. I mean, Texas is a very special place. I love it, but there's a lot of learning and education there and awareness. So that is hopefully what the book will bring too.
Great. Jenny.
Well, it's interesting with Anna Kay, it was really a retelling of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, like I said. So it wasn't necessarily in any way based on my life. I grew up actually in Tennessee in a small town and I was not an uber wealthy billionaire's daughter, basically. But the reason why I chose to make Anna half Korean and half white, I guess, is the fact that my brother is married. I always say my brother's married to a blonde woman instead of saying that she's married to a white woman. And so his kids, he has 3 children, my nieces and nephews, who are all Korean American, but they happen to live in a fairly affluent white area outside in Pennsylvania. And my brother was talking to me about it about 10 years ago. And he's like, oh, the one thing I feel bad about living in an non-urban area with my children is that they don't really see other kids of other races, really. Definitely not very many mixed kids. So he's like, I need you to like write stories about kids that are the leads of, you know, their own narrative, basically. And so that's why it was really important. And he was like, I want you to write about biracial kids. And I was like, you got it, I'm gonna do it. And so it was important to me to sort of do that, to tell it on that side. I mean, there's a lot of wealth privilege in Anna Kay, but I definitely, the moral center of the book is Dustin, who is adopted, half Black and half Jewish. So I really wanted to give also many different perspectives. Basically, like those who feel like they're on the outside, but then as you get to know them, maybe they're not on the outside. Maybe it's like, basically I was trying to not make anyone feel like an outsider, I guess. And so show many different perspectives of all these different kids that populate the book.
Almost sort of normalizing what's considered like the I hate this word choice, but like the fringe of normality or something like that, which I love, because I think that whole idea is its own issue.
Right.
Coco.
So I think the interesting thing about writing Shadow Frost and Godstorm and the 3rd book of the Shadow Frost trilogy has been sort of like me looking back on my evolution and development as a writer and as a young person. And, you know, there's so much, because I wrote Shadow Frost when I was 15, and I was at a school that in Toronto, like it was very sheltered. I think like half the kids were Asian. And so, you know, when like I heard the phrase like, oh, Asians are a minority, I was like, wait, what are you talking about? Because like for me, like in that community, I never felt that. And then I moved to New York City for 2 years of high school, because I was attending the Juilliard School for Piano. And it was there that I really, like, my eyes opened, and, you know, I was taking more classes and that kind of thing. And so, like, right now, actually, I'm working on 2 books. I'm working on the 3rd book of Shadow Frost, and then another book, which is, I think, a lot more reflective of, like, my growing beliefs and values, like, as a young adult, because, like, I just turned 20, and, like, you know, back when I was young, I thought, like, oh, this is, like, I probably know quite a lot. And then, like, you know, the next year you think, well, I know as much as I can now, but like I knew so little like last year, and then like it keeps going. So like now that I'm officially an adult, like looking back at you know, my beliefs and values, they've really evolved. And so the Shadow Frost trilogy doesn't really focus on race. It's, for me, it was, you know, the fact that I was a young person and I had been told by so many adults that, you know, you should wait like a few more years to do something like that. Like you probably can't accomplish that at your age. So that was the manifestation of like my, I guess my frustrations as a young person, and that reflected in Shadow Frost through the characters who are all teenagers, of course, since it's YA, but there's like a lot of struggle in terms of just like finding oneself as a young person. Whereas, you know, the stuff that I'm working on now is like much more focused on, you know, things like the rent crisis in New York and that kind of thing, and just like the disparity between like minorities and like white privilege and that kind of thing. But for me, it's still all a learning process, and, you know, I'm trying to read a lot more now, and it's been very eye-opening. So
age is part of identity too, right? Is a big one. Mintie.
I call my book Brown Girl, so yeah, it's about race. It's about intersectionality, and I'm 44, And I came to a point where I was just annoyed because I didn't see my story out there. I mean, Brown Girl Ghosted comes from my life, but also throughout my life of like meeting people who we didn't see ourselves represented. So it's specifically about hashtag only brown face in the place. So growing up as one of the only minorities, like Jenny was talking about, in a small Midwestern town, and what that does as far as like how whiteness shapes your ethnicity, your identity, and how much that plays into like, I mean, white privilege, but also like, I think a lot of times in America, the race conversation happens between like black and white, and brown via Indian American is forgotten a lot. So I really wanted to do that, as well as bring a brown girl up who's like, write about one who's not necessarily calculating the mathematical equations or this being the sidekick, but she's like the kick-ass heroine who gets the guy. Spoiler alert, she gets the guy. It's not, the book's not even about the guy.
No.
So I think I just wanted to write something about, I mean, that I had never seen growing up. There's some great Indian American authors in YA who are doing awesome stuff too, but a lot of times our narrative also gets stereotyped into just being about arranged marriages, which is, it's valid, it's just not the entire experience, not everyone's experience. So I wanted to kind of like stay away from all of that stuff and just write about a girl who I wanted to meet.
Yeah, I love that all of you talk about there's pieces of yourselves in the books, but they're not necessarily about you, right? So there's like so much that's fictionalized, but it's grounded in aspects of your identity that you wish you had seen on a page, right? Whether it's age or gender or race or whatever it might be.
Not just in a stereotypical fashion.
That's right.
Often what happens when anything having to do with anyone who isn't white happens, right, in terms of characterization. So our next question is actually more about audience, and especially, you know, your audience of young adults as well, in terms of what they need to think about when they're reading these books with all of these different voices. And so our question is, what do young people need to think about when they're reading books like this in terms of contextualizing the voices that they're reading about?
I think like just to further it a little bit more, I've been thinking a lot about this just in terms of teaching. So like when we're introducing books, when we're working with high school, secondary, you know, middle school kids, like how do we help not just hand them books about all different kinds of people, but also understand that there's like, you need to understand about the people that you're reading about, right? So there's ways to contextualize what you're reading. So I don't know, maybe this is turning into a longer question, but who wants to go first? Mintie, should we? Oh, Jenny. Yay.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Jenny.
Start with you, but Jenny, go for it.
I volunteered to go first mainly because I was like, oh, interesting. I don't know if I thought about all these things as I wrote my book, right? I mean, I really, yes, it's definitely a young adult novel because all the main characters are teenagers. So that's the classification of book publishing and how it works. So Catcher in the Rye, if it was published today, would be considered a young adult novel, even though back then it was not. It was just a book, basically. So it's sort of interesting because I've had a lot of questions about, you know, I have a drugs and sex and a lot of language, bad language in my book. And it's funny because it was picked for Book of the Month Club. And I think that audience was mainly not teenagers and a lot of older women. So on Instagram, I was able to really read a lot of comments, and I was just, so many mothers were upset over my book. They were like, oh my gosh, the drugs and the sex. I mean, it was just so much, like a tonnage. And so funny because I really was like, oh, I felt like I was continually pulling back basically a little bit on that area. I mean, because yes, it's a soap opera and it's about a very privileged group of teenagers who probably are far more sophisticated and older acting than their age would present. You know, they've just experienced more things and been around. They have absentee parents, etc. So I think that they maybe gotten into a little bit more trouble, but it's not that I just made it up. I mean, I did do some research of friends and private school kids in New York City, and there are a lot of these things. I just don't know people, maybe parents don't want to know that that's what's going on. So, I mean, or people turn a blind eye. So I was careful with that. I mean, I really wanted to make sure I don't know. I don't know if I was writing for teenagers, except saying I think these are the characters who happen to be teenagers, and I'm going to write about them. And hopefully, what you'll see is that they have different ideas about sex and drugs and also in relationships, basically, because everyone's very different. And I mean, growing up, I had very different viewpoints than a lot of my friends. Like, I was considered a little wild and like snuck out of the house and whatnot, even though I was also like the perfect Korean girl who got perfect grades, and my parents had no idea and was so nice and wasn't allowed to wear makeup or high heels, but I was sneaking it and it was all in my locker. So I mean, there's a little bit of things that I think that you just, I don't know, right, that's character based, basically. And I'm just hoping that as now I am seeing more teenagers read it, that they connect with something, And also, my book really isn't issue based. I don't think. I really wanted to also be a sort of a soapy, fun Gossip Girl book with, hopefully it'll like sneak up on you any sort of messages or interesting things that you learn, I guess.
Yeah.
The plan.
No, that makes sense. I think a lot of adults don't want to think about what teenagers are really doing.
I had vaping in my book, so that's not good, right?
But I mean, very on topic.
Yes, right.
Especially it's who's the audience you're writing for, right? Like, is it the kids or is it people who don't want to know what their kids are doing, right?
Yeah. I think with my book too, I wanted people to understand how it felt to be transgender, how it felt to walk into a bathroom and be scared, and to have my guard up, or Pony has his guard up, and to see every experience he gets pulled over by the cops and his dead name still on his ID. There's so many times, there's so many thought processes going on in my head, especially when I first transitioned, that I wanted people to be aware of, so that once they have awareness and understanding and empathy for people, they can accept them more. And that was a big hope, that people read, cisgendered people read and understood how difficult and how many challenges there are, and also joy in being transgender. But that was so important for people to get in the head and maybe have more understanding around that.
Natasha, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, so I feel like I touch on a lot of things in the book, in terms of multiracial identity, in terms of being secular, being a part of the secular Jewish community, and sort of the tension between practicing Jews and non-practicing Jews. And also I tried to touch on some pretty prevalent anti-Blackness racism within the white Jewish community. And when you're in a interracial family and you have a biracial or multiracial child who, is feeling like they don't fit in any part of their culture, and that even as that shows up at the dinner table, how do you combat that? And so what I was really trying to speak to, what Nevaeh goes through, the journey she goes through in the book, is she starts off and she thinks of herself as invisible because she can't see herself in any one part of her identity. And so she feels like she can't exist at all unless she's broken out into pieces. You obviously can't be alive if you're cut up. And so by the end of it, she finds her voice, and she finds comfort in who she is as a whole person. And she sort of has to recreate her identity so that she can exist in it comfortably. And so I think whether or not you're multiracial or multi-ethnic or interfaith or anything, I think that young people are trying to figure out who they are, right? So even if they don't fit into any of those specific categories, I hope and I tried my best to relate to anyone who's feeling like they don't feel comfortable in their own skin. And I think that's something that no matter what and who you are, everyone goes through that, especially when you're at this age range, like 14 to 18, when you're really turning into an adult, you're really turning into a human. You have to be accountable for your actions and your words, and you have to define yourself in a lot of ways. And so, so I hoped that it would make anyone who's been in that place of not feeling comfortable with who they are to know that they're not alone. And I also hope that for anyone who, even if maybe they've only experienced that a little bit, or if they haven't, that they can have empathy for their peers who do feel that way, and try to be a little bit more careful in the way that they communicate around them to make them feel more welcomed.
That really connects to, I think, what Tobly was just saying too, about that the desire to build empathy through representing different voices so that we better understand each other. And that even kind of made me think of what, Coco, you were saying before, about your most recent writing, especially about how that's kind of you working through some of that too, and kind of trying to make sense of who your character was, who they're becoming, and that sort of thing. So do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like what Natasha and Tobly were saying, like, I mean, both of what you said basically just really resonated with me too, because like I'm growing up right now, and just I think especially like in the sequel to Shadowfrost, it's like literally the characters are struggling, they're growing up, they're looking at their past mistakes and like the mistakes they made at the end of the first book, and realizing like that, you know, it's time to, you know, hold yourself accountable to those mistakes, and also like how to just move past them and become a better person. I think another aspect that was really interesting for me was that I remember, I know you're not supposed to read reviews like from readers like when your book comes out and that kind of thing, but I remember reading a lot of comments that were like, for the first time, like I actually felt like it was like teenagers talking, and then there were also comments that were like, you know, I'm in my 30s, so maybe, you know, whatever, but I felt like the dialogue was like really juvenile and that kind of thing. And I thought that was hilarious because like when I was writing it, I was like, it was a lot of the stuff and ideas that I took for the dialogue were like from my own life. So when people were telling me that the dialogue was like juvenile and stuff, and I was like, okay. So that was a fun.
Yeah, well, okay, number one, Jenny and I were actually talking about this. Yeah, I wanted to write a book about race and identity and things, but I wanted to bring humor. And I love fun, frothy, guilty pleasure stuff like Gossip Girl. I'm dating myself here, Dynasty, man. I mean, like, that's fun. So I mean, race is serious, identity is serious, but I mean, like, I think humor is a great way to kind of introduce it and make it more accessible. So I wanted to bring as much of that as possible. And with that, yeah, I didn't really think about as far as I am a perpetual 16-year-old girl. Like that's who I am, no matter how old I get. I kind of can't remember anything in my life after the age of 21. So Coco, write this shit down that's happening to you. You're not gonna have material after a year. So, so I feel very like that age, kind of teenagehood resonates really well with me because I feel very close to that struggle that I think we've all discussed right now of feeling like you just don't fit in for whatever reason. Even if you're like the white cis hetero jock guy, you know, I mean, so I really wanted to touch upon those things because I think those are universal. I mean, one thing in my life is I wanted to bring this book into my Midwestern life, but I always had this dichotomy of my father works for the United Nations, so I grew up living all over the world. And then I would come back to like Friday football games and, you know, chili suppers in the Midwest. And I mean, one thing I learned from that experience of growing up is everyone feels like a dipshit everywhere. Like you always feel so, and I think that's something that no matter what my character looked like and what she was going through, I think that's what makes it relatable, and everything else is kind of just dressing, you know, and that's the fun part, writing the story. And yeah, I mean, there's sex, drugs, and rock and roll in it because that's what we did in the Midwest because there's nothing else to do. And if parents have a problem with it, then just, I mean, like, what were you reading at that? I mean, I loved reading stuff that was too old for me. Like I was, you know, when you were like 12, I was trying to read like V.C. Andrews.
Oh, I was gonna say.
Yeah, Flowers in the Attic and all that. So
around, yeah, it got like
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember being like 10 and going to Yugoslavia with a copy of like Rich Man, Poor Man or whatever, you know, I mean, like some Judith Krantz bullshit. So it's like, oh God, I forget that this is like for children. My language, even my language is not acceptable. So you can imagine the book has a lot of dirty language in it.
Well, what I love is that you're all talking about, you know, writing the characters that are not white, cis, male, female, even, you know, those characters, but yet there's a piece of anyone who can connect just from being a teenager, just from being a human being, just from experiencing the world growing up, right? So I think that that's such an important message to kids, is that, like, even if someone doesn't look like you, come from your same cultural background, identity background, like, what can you connect to, right? Because we all have similarities, and that, I love that you all just spoke to that. I want to actually pick up on something that a lot of you were talking about. And so I'm curious, and we'll start with Coco, since you're probably the closest to this question, but
I know exactly where you're going with this. I like it.
so what aspects of your identity have changed or evolved since high school, and which have stayed the same? And then how does this affect the stories you tell? But mostly, like, I'm curious which parts of you still resonate from high school, and then what's really changed.
Okay, so I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I used to think that all advice from older people was rubbish. So I was like the first book is like all about, you know, like the mom saying stuff, and then at the end all of it is false, and like no spoilers, but like anyway, so like it was just like me figuring out who to listen to, like finding my own voice and all of that stuff. And then I realized that like nowadays there's a point where, you know, there's reason in an adult's voice, and there's a, like, I mean, like you guys, for example, the advice that you would give me is probably from personal experience and that kind of thing. And so by me like listening to that and not necessarily following it, but like, you know, just absorbing it and that kind of thing, I can make my own decisions, and it also helps me figure out like what I stand for and what I believe in versus like maybe I don't agree with that kind of thing. And so I guess, yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things from high school. God, I'm like flashbacking right now. And then another thing is that, you know, once I moved to New York, like I was actually at an international private school in New York City, and like Jenny, what you were saying earlier, it's very valid. Yeah, I can vouch for that. And I realized, you know, there's like, and especially like living in New York City was like it's so multicultural, multi-ethnic, and I think like especially being at an international school, I was around so many other people from so many other different cultures and that kind of thing. So that's definitely, it's like much more significant in like the stuff that I'm writing now. And just, I guess, you know, I'm trying to think of like a way to talk about my new project without saying anything, because I don't think I'm allowed to yet. So, but yeah, like the stuff that I've learned from then is definitely going to make its way into my writing now. I don't know if that's...
As you slowly roll away.
Mintie, how about you? What you said you still are like a 16-year-old at heart.
Yeah.
What most of you are still 16, and what's not?
I think I'm still awkward, and I don't always, you know, fit in, and I feel kind of whatever, not always cool, but the difference is I'm cool with that now. You know, like I'm so comfortable with being, I mean, I live in Helsinki, Finland. I am like one of the only brown people here. So, I mean, like, I'm cool with like kind of standing out. And my difference is, I know it's so like, it should be on a t-shirt kind of thing, but I mean, it really is true that like, I love the things that make me different and make me stand out now. Whereas opposed, I'm not trying to blend in for those things, you know, and trying to hide those things like I did in high school. So I think that's what's kind of like, that's what's changed, but it's been an evolution that's been really cool to kind of like watch too.
For the record, I think you're hella cool, so you got that.
Thank you, Coco. Let's talk in 2 years when you forget everything that's going on in your life.
Yeah, on like on the night of my 22nd birthday, I'll just like black out and then like wait, like where am I? And like the light
Wait,
in my head will just like,
copyright. That's my story. Copyright. I'm writing that one.
Good book. Natasha, how about you? What's the same? What's different?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in New York City, and it's similar to what Coco was saying. Like I feel I was sort of sheltered in this unusual way where I like my family in a lot of ways was not weird, that it was, you know, interracial and Jewish, and I went to public schools and all my friend groups were extremely diverse in every possible way, and you know, like our teachers walked out and went to protests with us in the middle of the school day. Like it was a very leftist liberal world that I grew up in. And when I went to college, that was really the first time that I was in a mostly white, affluent environment, and it was really shocking for me. I went through a lot of like, oh, like it was a lot, and since then I moved out of New York City, which I felt like was a really important thing to do. I moved to California for a few years, still never learned how to drive. I'm a real New Yorker. But yeah, so I feel like I had a chance from high school. For me was maybe like the best time of my life, which I think is unusual, and I feel really fortunate that I had that the experience that I did at this, like, again, just very inclusive, forward-thinking, progressive school, and with people from all over the city. My friends were from Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan, and we all came together, and it was a really cool, amazing experience. And since then, I've sort of seen the uglier sides of the world, and experienced that ugliness directed at me, which is not pleasant, but I think is important for growth and for learning. And I'm a new mom, and so that's really that's a change, but that's also something that's informed my becoming a parent. But in terms of newness, the minute I got pregnant, I moved right back to New York City. I'm back in these streets, pretty much would be doing everything I would normally be doing, just with a baby in my hand, except there's a pandemic, so I'm just inside.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
Jenny, how about you?
What's the same and what's different? Let's think. You know, I went to New York. I grew up in small town Tennessee. We were the only Asian family. Well, there were two. There was one that owned the Chinese restaurant in town, but they didn't speak very much English and they had no children. So it was just a young couple. And then there was my family. My dad was a doctor, and it was just me. I mean, my brother and sister had already gone to college. And going to public high school there, I will say that I've learned a lot. I don't know. I just feel like, I don't know if it was the time then when I was growing up, that obviously people weren't talking about race as much. It wasn't segregated, but it might as well have been in Tennessee, right? There was like a very definitive divide between like the Black kids where they sat and the white kids, basically. And I sat with the white kids, but I think about it sometimes, and I think it's more about like affluence. And my father was a doctor, so we were well off in the town, right? In a town that's not very well off. And so I think that automatically put me up into a certain group, because I have thought about it now. I have to say, when during the time, I didn't really think about it that much. So now when I see teenagers today that are so incredibly aware of issues and causes, it's like amazing to see, but it's also like, wow, I was so insular into my own little world and really not thinking about the world. And it's almost embarrassing to think about the things that I didn't think about as a teenager in that town. I mean, I definitely dealt with racism, I mean, for sure, but I don't know what it was. My brother and I have very different experiences. I don't know if it's because he was a boy. I think it's more difficult for men sometimes. He got run off of a tennis court while playing tennis with, you know, one of the Black kids from the town. I mean, they just got run off by two guys in a pickup truck. It was like a very formative experience in his life that I just never had anything that terrible. I mean, if we're going there, I had like a crank it was back when they could do crank calls when we didn't have cell phones, and I got a crank call and they would play like Born in the USA, like on the phone. And I was like, I was born in the USA, but it was one of those things. And I just hung up and we didn't have conversations with my parents about things like that. Because my parents were actually, my father's a doctor, was trying to blend in. So I actually don't even speak the language Korean because my parents were trying to assimilate basically into white culture. And it's so interesting. So when I went to NYU for college, and there were so many Korean kids, it was a huge culture shock for me because I had never really spent any time with them. And what I found fascinating is that they weren't as that welcoming. I mean, I was full Korean, but because I had grown up in a different area, they were sort of like not the nicest to me either. So it's like, it was an odd thing, even though I was fully Korean, it doesn't matter. It really is like a background thing. And I think it's kind of like what Mintie said, like now that I'm older, I'm just okay with it all. Like I can understand what's happening in a bigger worldview. I mean, and I really like what Natasha had to say about like what is important in these books for young people is that they have to see themselves reflected, but they also have to, maybe if we could be a little bit more empathetic. I mean, I think that really, you know, maybe by reading about kids that are trans and all different ethnicities and biracial and fluid, etc., it will just be like, oh, this is normal and I should just sort of accept everyone. I mean, I think that's where we're going towards, which I think is hugely important. I worked on the Disney Channel show as a writer of Shake It Up. And the one reason why I'm bringing it up is that I thought Disney, even though they are a little bit evil empire and going to soon own all of Hollywood, they do have an interesting approach on their children's shows, which is every single show must be cast very multiculturally. They do not talk about race because it's the Disney Channel. I mean, I think they're changing now, even from like 8 years ago, where, you know, they had a kid who was a lesbian. I mean, they're definitely changing their stances because before we weren't allowed to discuss any of those type of matters, but they were of the mind, like we need to show children at home that the world is just multicolored and that's just how it is without commenting on it. And I think that's important too. I mean, I think you should comment on it, but I also think it's just like how you populate the world. Like my books, I think have a very, very multicultural, a lot of different religions, a lot of different, you know, sexualities, genders, but I don't necessarily open the dialogue unless it's character specific or a situation where it needs to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of add it in. So
Great.
I don't know if I answered the question though, you guys.
No, you did. It's interesting to think about just the shifts. Tobly, how about for you? High school.
Oh yeah, this is a great question. Everybody's answers are amazing. Okay, I'm gonna say, if you can see the puppets behind me, like I'm just as weird as I used to be in high school. I was like a very weird kid. I was the mascot of my high school. I was 5th in the nation. I was a dancing bulldog, which gave me the awareness to write George's character because I was hanging out with the cheerleaders. But now I put on musicals, parody musicals, and they play around the US actually. Me and my best friend write them. So I have always stayed as weird and as fascinated with the things I love, which is great. I think the big difference is in high school, I didn't want to be who I was, you know, all the feelings I was having, all the I was trying to get away from it and be something else. And throughout my many years, I moved to New York from Texas, and I've lived here for 16 years. I've become truer to myself and who I am, and moved closer to who I am, and become more comfortable in my skin and everything. And that's been a beautiful process that's taken a lot of time. But I think the kids today are way ahead of where I was in the 90s, and that's so inspiring, you know. So my book Stay Gold, it's a reference to The Outsiders, because I've always felt like an outsider, and I used to kind of be embarrassed by it, but now I'm really proud of being an outsider and kind of being weird.
Mintie, did you ever live in New York?
No, I can't handle New York. I'm way too uncool for New York. I like big fish, little pond, and Helsinki, Finland, kind of thing. But can I just say one thing about what Jenny was saying with the Disney Channel? I think this is what's so cool about getting to write YA, because so much, like just in literature that was like about immigrants or ethnicity and things. Like let's take Jhumpa Lahiri or something, which I love Jhumpa. I'm not gonna like get down on a brown girl, but a lot of the times the only immigrant experience that's accepted is one where we aren't allowed to speak about our feelings. and what it feels like to be the outsider, the other. And whereas it's focused on doing and things. So I feel like YA has always been a space where that is explored, even as early as like the Babysitters Club and stuff, you know, where like there's a little bit more discussion and we're freer, because people always think like, you know, they dismiss YA as not being like serious literature, but I think that's what gives us this incredible freedom to talk about these feelings. And even if we're talking about it from a teenage perspective, I think we get to explore it in a way that, because there's something really problematic about just showing all of these different identities, but not allowing them to explore, because that's lends itself to tokenism. You know, that is the 90210 minority, where it's like random brown girl shows up and dates Steve for a couple of weeks. But you're like, oh, okay, how'd you end up here? What's going on? You know, so but I'm just saying, like, that's what I love about YA, because we can actually give words and feelings to those things and explore it.
I think YA is dealing with issues in the world way more than adult books are. I mean, I really feel like YA is the place where these issues are being written about and discussed.
I absolutely agree. And I was just going to add on too that I think that so many, I sort of hate that YA class of, like, when people see YA, they automatically think that it's like for young adults, because I think that adults get a ton from these. I mean, I know that I feel like I read more YA than I do adult novels, because I think they're talking about things that adult novels have not yet, or they're just starting to broach. So in some ways they're sort of ahead of the curve in that way. So I actually wanted to pick up on something that Jenny said, and then Tobly, you were mentioning as well. So we were talking about how, like, when we were growing up, and I was thinking about myself too as we were talking about this, and the things that we were focused on, which for me, and what you guys were saying too, it's kind of like yourselves and what's going on in your little bubble and not the greater world. And obviously we've seen, especially in the last couple months, that student activists have really been emerging and really leading the charge, which is amazing. And so considering the fact that you are writing books that showcase teens and oftentimes are for teens, what advice would you have for student activists, especially those that are reading your texts and engaging in the world and seeing the things that you're talking about as well? What should they read? What should they watch? Anything from your experience, or even thinking about now, what you would say to them? I'll start out with Natasha.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree. Like, I think young people are the ones who really are leading the charge, who are not afraid to be talking about things that when I was growing up were taboo to talk about, and really unafraid to be authentically themselves and their whole selves, and demanding respect for their whole identity. And I think that's amazing, and I think it's important to keep doing that. And I think it's also important for older people and older generations who are also progressive to back them up, because you know, a lot of times I think people will brush off like an older person and be like, oh, it's just their generation. And it's like, no, they can say your correct pronoun, right? Like that's not a hard thing to do, and it shouldn't be something that is only respected in certain groups, right? Like, that's you're talking about someone's identity, you're talking about who they are, and that deserves respect, especially because it doesn't do anything to you to offer that. And so I think it's amazing to see young people doing what they're doing, but I also think that we need to have their backs, and part of what I hope to do with Color Me and in future books and projects is to like put respect on their name and how I'm writing them, right? Because I'm not going to make them passive on the page, because that's not how they are in the real world. And so in terms of stuff they could be reading, I mean, I really pretty much only read YA, partially just because I think if you're writing in that world, it's important to see what else is going on, because there's every genre possible in YA and they're all incredible. I think books that do really amazing job of reflecting the fight for social justice right now is anything Angie Thomas writes, On the Come Up, The Hate You Give. I know she has Concrete Rose coming out. Tiffany D. Jackson writes incredible books about, she writes like I don't know I'd say like thriller or mystery, but there's always like a big twist, and it's like stories about like murders or missing people, but she writes it through the voice of people who rarely get a microphone. And so you're sort of what Mintie was saying you do with your book, where you were like, I want to portray a brown girl who's like doing all these amazing things that we never get to see. We sort of get that voice in these really incredible scenarios of a young Black girl in DC who never gets called on in the classroom, and we get to hear her voice and see what her life is like. So those are just two authors off the top of my head that I really recommend people check out because they're incredible.
Great. I love what you said too about demanding respect for your identity. I think that's like perfectly said. Tobly, go ahead.
Yeah, so when it comes to transgender and non-binary world, when I think about it, we need allies more than anything. And my book calls for that too, because there's not tons of transgender people. There's not an army of us, but we need allies that speak up for us, that help educate their family members who need education, who just keep fighting the fight for us, because there's a lot of people to enlighten, and we need as much help as possible. But what's so exciting about, especially in YA, is the number of authors that are trans that are writing right now, with Jackson Bird, Thomas McBee Page, he wrote Amateur, Case and Calendar, Cemetery Boys. Just that there is this wealth of books is incredible and so inspiring. And when it comes to the young activists, they're doing such an amazing job, and they see it better than us. They see how this world should be better than us. And I understand that it's frustrating that it can't all change quickly. But what I see is that boat metaphor, that the boat has to turn in small notches, for if it goes too quick, it tumps over. But if they can see how much they're doing right now and the change it's making, it really is making a big difference, even if it doesn't feel drastic right away happening now, which is inspiring too.
So I think one of the most amazing things that I've personally noticed, and that I'm super proud to be part of this generation, is like our creativity and resourcefulness. We have so much technology and like social media platforms. Like we have so many resources available to us to be able to speak up. Like there's a lot of difficult discussions that I think are really, really important to have, and it is always worth putting that time. And and I mean, if people don't want to listen to you and like they refuse to discuss, just like keep trying, and then just never stop trying and never take no for an answer.
I still am so amazed by how resourceful the teenage movements are. Like it's shocking and amazing and wonderful, and things that I like at my age, even like I don't think in my mind that I'm that old until I like look in the mirror. But the things that they're able to do, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm like, just like the stuff that TikTokers are capable of is just like, and
Yeah, well, because I'm based here in Europe too, it's really cool because I get to travel around here and see kids from all over, and then also be in the States. And there's so much of a synergy, and like just this, the young people today just inspire me. They inspire me so greatly. And I think like, I would say, keep on creating your stories. But not just that, aspire to be the people who determine what stories are told. I mean, it like that's amazing creativity, but take it, so be the movie directors and the heads of studios and the heads of, the editors and the publishing world and things, and because I think that's a big step that I'd like to see these kids take, so that these, the people who determine who the storytellers are look more like all of us and have voices like us. So that's what I would say, like, keep on keeping on.
Jenny,
and this isn't planned, but I would also tell them to read Jenny Lee's book. But that's a real, again, like, sounds like everyone's book here is really exciting, but like Angie Thomas, Jenny, I mean, there's just a fabulous wealth of like young adult writers.
oh yeah, I just want to add my author mama, Nick Stone. Yeah, just her as well. So yeah.
And I want to say, Michaela Cole, anything Michaela Cole makes is incredible. Yeah. I don't know her, so she's not an author mama or a friend in any way, but.
Great, Jenny, how about you?
I guess advice, I mean, maybe I'll make it specific towards any teenagers who want to write, I guess. It's like since I was little, always wanted to write. My parents, of course, which sounds very stereotypical, but was very true, is they wanted me to be a doctor. And I think the quote was, we don't know if you're smart enough to be a doctor. I mean, they want me to be a lawyer because they didn't know if I was smart enough to be the doctor. My brother is a doctor, of course. He's an MD, PhD, which allowed me to be kind of the creative, like quirky one. What I will say about writing, and it's like, you know, I'm very impressed with you, Coco, of like your young age, and you seem so polished. And I mean, I was thinking you were young. I had no idea quite how young you were. I really want to say that read everything. I know it's like such an odd sort of statement. Like I went through a Stephen King phase. I went through a horror phase. I'm like, even now at my age, kind of moving into fantasy because I had read Lee Bardugo's The Ninth House over Christmas. And I was like, oh, wow, fantasy. Because sometimes, you know, you're like, oh, fantasies are, I'm not a fantasy person, but you don't know what kind of person you are yet. And I definitely think for teenagers, you really should try everything. Like, I really think that has really added to my writing, like the most, in terms of like, just it makes you see the world in a much bigger place if you read all sorts of books. I mean, and I definitely read above my age too. I say with TV, it might be a little bit different. I'm not definitely promoting like watch everything that's, even if it's too old for you. I don't necessarily, I think images kind of last with you longer. And like, I'm not saying if, you know, there's some really stressful documentaries that stress me out. So I'm not saying that. In terms of TV shows, like I think Sex Education is one of the best great TV shows out there because, you know, it's teenagers and they're fumbling through something that's very difficult and important, and it's, you know, can be ugly and awkward and terrible. And that's probably closer to the truth than any of the things that, you know, we read about, you know, when we were younger, being perfect in rose petals and flowers. It's not always that. So I mean, that's, I guess my advice is to be varied. To talk to the girls really quick with Anna K, I don't know if it's a spoiler alert, but the ending is different from Anna Karenina. And I knew immediately I was going to change it because for me and Anna Karenina, she made one big mistake, huge mistake. In the 1800s in Russia, you do not cheat on your husband. It's bad. Things will go very badly for you and spiral out of control. These days, and when you're a teenager, you can make mistakes. I think everyone's so nervous about that. I mean, I was terrified about like, you know, getting in trouble. And one of the best things that happened to me is I did get caught eventually for sneaking out of the house and borrowing the family car, busted huge, like big time. But in a way, it was good for me in a way because I tried that sort of walk. And then I had a very tame senior year where I did like more high school things and hung out with high school kids instead of trying to be older and hanging out with college kids. So, I mean, I think it really, all your experiences that you're going through, the good and the bad, will really, I don't know, it's shaping you into who you're going to be. And it's okay to try stuff and be like, ew, I'm not that person. So, I mean, I think that's what you really got to think about is just, I don't know, try stuff, experiment. I mean, nothing crazy, but and then you'll see what feels right to you and then go forward in that. And then in your 20s, if you hate it, you change because that's the one thing that I will say at my age. Like, I mean, I've lived a lot of different varied sort of lives and I'm a better person and hopefully a writer because of it. So that's my spiel.
Well, thank you all so much. I can't believe it's already been an hour. We have so many more questions to ask you, but I'm getting it's time. So I just want to thank all of you so much for joining us tonight. Whoever's watching this out there, hopefully lots of you read all of these books because they are amazing and varied and really, really important and super enjoyable. I mean, they're just fun books. So everyone should pick them up and read them. And thank you to all of you for coming to us from California and Helsinki and New York and everywhere. So thank you all.
On behalf of StoryFest, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this panel, head over to our StoryFest 2020 playlist and check out the rest of our virtual author events. And for more information about StoryFest, visit the library's website at www.westportlibrary.org.